Hey guys. Settle here, tonight we began what sex was like in medieval times and more. But before we get started, make sure that you subscribed and comment me where are you watching from. Sex in medieval times was never just sex. It was a problem to be managed, a risk to be controlled, a responsibility that arrived long before anyone was ready and lingered long after anyone was willing. It was discussed constantly, regulated obsessively, and understood poorly. This combination ensured that it remained confusing, stressful, and unavoidable for nearly everyone involved. You were not expected to understand your body. Understanding implied curiosity, and curiosity implied temptation. Instead, you were expected to obey rules that were explained with confidence and enforced with fear. These rules changed depending on who you were, where you lived, and which authority was currently watching. None of them were especially clear, and most of them contradicted one another in subtle but important ways. If you were born into the medieval world, your first lesson about sex was silence. It was not discussed openly in families. Parents did not explain it to children. They assumed knowledge would arrive naturally, the way illness does. When it did arrive, it came late, incomplete, and often incorrect. By the time you were expected to participate, you were already expected to feel ashamed of it. Marriage did not exist for love. Love was considered unstable, irrational, and unreliable. Marriage existed for property, alliances, labor, and legitimacy. Sex was simply one of its many obligations, listed somewhere between producing heirs and not embarrassing your family. Desire was not required. In fact, desire was viewed with suspicion. Too much enthusiasm suggested moral weakness. Too little suggested disobedience. The correct emotional posture was reluctant compliance. The church had opinions about this. Many opinions. Most of them were delivered confidently and enforced selectively. Sex was allowed, but only under the right conditions, at the right times, with the right person, and for the right reasons. Pleasure was tolerated only if it arrived accidentally and was not enjoyed too openly. The idea that someone might seek sex for pleasure alone was considered deeply dangerous. Pleasure distracted the soul. Pleasure invited chaos. Pleasure led to questions. There were days when sex was forbidden. Many days. Holy days, fasting days, Sundays, saints' days, periods of mourning, periods of prayer, periods of reflection, periods when someone somewhere had decided that abstinence was necessary for the moral health of the community. Depending on the calendar, this could eliminate nearly half the year. No one was entirely sure which days counted. People argued about it constantly. The solution, for many, was ignorance mixed with optimism. Medical understanding did not help. Medieval medicine was built on inherited authority rather than observation. Ancient texts were treated as truth, even when they contradicted lived experience. Doctors believed that bodies were governed by humors, invisible fluids that needed to remain in balance. Sex, they believed, affected this balance dramatically. Too much could weaken a man. Too little could cause dangerous pressure to build inside the body. Women were thought to suffer even more if desire went unfulfilled, though this belief did not translate into increased sympathy. Female desire was acknowledged only when it could be used to justify control. Women were said to be naturally more lustful, more easily tempted, and therefore more in need of supervision. This logic was circular but effective. If a woman desired sex, it proved she needed restraint. If she did not, it proved she was unnatural. There was no correct answer. For men, sex was framed as both duty and threat. A man was expected to produce heirs, but also to remain morally disciplined. Failure in either direction was judged harshly. Impotence was humiliating. Excess was sinful. Moderation was praised, but never clearly defined. Most people learned about sex indirectly. Through jokes, warnings, confessions, sermons, and whispered conversations. None of these were designed to inform. They were designed to regulate behavior. Fear was a teaching tool. Shame was a social adhesive. Together, they ensured compliance without requiring clarity. Privacy was rare. Houses were small. Beds were shared. Servants, children, relatives, and animals often occupied the same space. Sex was technically private, but practically observable. This created a strange contradiction. Something everyone knew was happening was treated as unspeakable. Contraception existed, but it was unreliable and rarely discussed openly. Herbal knowledge circulated quietly, often among women, and often condemned by authorities. Anything that separated sex from reproduction was viewed with suspicion. The idea that someone might want control over when or whether to have children threatened social order. Pregnancy was dangerous. Childbirth was terrifying. Infant mortality was common. None of this reduced the expectation to continue. Sex led to children. Children led to labor. Labor sustained households. Households sustained society. Individual suffering was considered an acceptable cost. Outside marriage, sex was condemned publicly and practiced privately. Prostitution existed openly in many cities, regulated rather than eliminated. Authorities recognized its usefulness as a pressure valve. Men were expected to struggle with desire. Women were expected to bear the consequences of that struggle. Punishments for sexual transgressions varied wildly. Some resulted in public humiliation. Some in fines. Some in exile. Enforcement depended less on the act itself and more on who was involved and who noticed. Reputation mattered more than truth. Religion framed sex as a moral battlefield. Desire was temptation. Restraint was virtue. Failure was inevitable. Confession existed to reset the system. Sin, regret, forgiveness, repetition. This cycle was familiar and strangely comforting. It provided structure to guilt. Love, when it appeared, did so quietly. It was not the foundation of marriage, but it sometimes grew within it. When it did, it was treated cautiously. Too much affection suggested imbalance. Too little suggested dysfunction. Again, moderation was praised and undefined. By modern standards, medieval sex seems restrictive, anxious, and deeply unfair. By medieval standards, it was simply life. People adapted. They laughed. They broke rules quietly. They endured. Sex was not a celebration. It was not an identity. It was not a right. It was a responsibility wrapped in fear and expectation, navigated with incomplete information and enforced by institutions that claimed certainty they did not possess. And yet, people continued. They formed relationships. They desired one another. They found ways to experience intimacy despite constraints. History records rules more often than behavior. The silence between laws tells its own story. This is what sex was like in medieval times. Not dramatic. Not romantic. Not entirely miserable. Just complicated, controlled, misunderstood, and unavoidable. Like most things in the medieval world. And the more you look at it, the more familiar it begins to feel. The medieval world did not believe that sex belonged to individuals. It belonged to families, to churches, to communities, and ultimately to God. Bodies were considered temporary housing for souls, and sex was one of the most disruptive activities a body could engage in. It produced pleasure, which was suspicious that it produced children, which were necessary. And it produced complications, which were inconvenient for anyone trying to maintain order. Because of this, sex was surrounded by instruction that often sounded precise but collapsed under scrutiny. People were told when it was allowed, but not how to navigate desire when it was not. They were told what was sinful, but not how to avoid it without suppressing basic human instincts. The result was a culture that talked endlessly about sex without ever explaining it. Confession became one of the few places where sex was discussed directly, though not comfortably. Priests were trained to ask detailed questions about acts they claimed were shameful to describe. Parishioners were expected to answer honestly while pretending not to understand the implications of their own words. This produced a strange intimacy between spiritual authority and private behavior. Your most personal experiences were examined not for understanding, but for classification. Lists existed. Lists of forbidden acts, forbidden positions, forbidden thoughts. Some were so specific they bordered on absurdity. Others were so vague they could apply to nearly anything. No one was entirely sure which lists were official and which were interpretations. This uncertainty worked in favor of authority. When rules are unclear, obedience becomes a constant effort. Sex between married couples was permitted, but only if intention aligned with doctrine. Intention mattered more than action. This made intention dangerous. You could perform the correct act and still sin if your thoughts were wrong. Desire was tolerated only when it pretended not to exist. This encouraged performance. People learned to appear reluctant. They learned to frame intimacy as duty. Pleasure was not denied outright, but it was never acknowledged openly. Enjoyment became something you experienced quietly and then apologized for later. For women, the risks were higher. Pregnancy changed lives permanently. Reputation followed you longer than disease. A woman's sexual history, real or imagined, could determine her entire future. Accusations mattered more than evidence. Silence was often safer than truth. Men were given more freedom, but also more pressure. Masculinity was tied to control. Losing control meant moral failure. Yet desire was described as unavoidable. This contradiction created constant anxiety. You were expected to struggle, but not fail. To desire, but not indulge. To act, but not enjoy. Education did not resolve this tension. Medieval universities taught theology, law, medicine, and philosophy, all of which had opinions about sex. None of them agreed completely. Students memorized texts that contradicted one another and were expected to reconcile them internally. Most did not try very hard. Medical texts described sex as a necessary release of bodily fluids. They warned that too much could cause weakness, madness, or death. Too little could cause equally alarming symptoms. Women were believed to require sexual release for health, though this belief did not translate into autonomy. Instead, it justified marriage at young ages and reinforced dependency. Youth was not protected. Puberty marked readiness for responsibility. Childhood ended abruptly. Curiosity was punished rather than guided. Ignorance was mistaken for innocence. When mistakes occurred, they were treated as moral failures rather than predictable outcomes. Sex outside marriage existed everywhere. It was managed rather than eliminated. Authorities understood that strict control without release led to unrest. Brothels were regulated. Prostitutes were marginalized but necessary. They absorbed social contradictions so respectable households could pretend stability. Violence was a constant background threat. Consent, as a concept, was not clearly defined. Power determined outcomes more often than intention. Law protected property more effectively than people. Sexual harm was addressed inconsistently, often minimized unless it disrupted social order. Love poetry flourished in this environment, quietly defiant. Courtly love existed largely in imagination, offering a safe space to explore desire without consequence. It separated love from sex, idealizing longing while avoiding reality. This made it popular and harmless. Marriage contracts were practical documents. They outlined property, inheritance, alliances. Emotional compatibility was irrelevant. Love was considered unreliable. Passion faded. Land endured. Inside these marriages, intimacy varied widely. Some couples developed affection. Some endured one another. Some lived parallel lives. History records rules, not feelings. The absence of complaint does not imply satisfaction. Sexual knowledge passed between women more often than men realized. Midwives understood bodies through experience. Their knowledge was respected and feared. When things went wrong, they were blamed. When things went right, they were ignored. Witchcraft accusations later absorbed sexual anxiety. Female sexuality, especially knowledge of reproduction, became dangerous. Control tightened. Fear replaced tolerance. What was once managed became hunted. Throughout all of this, people adapted. They laughed at rules they did not follow. They confessed sins they did not regret. They negotiated boundaries quietly. They lived within systems that did not trust them and found ways to survive anyway. Sex was never just private behavior. It was a reflection of power, belief, fear, and survival. It shaped families, economies, and laws. It was discussed constantly and understood poorly. And despite everything, people continued to seek intimacy. They formed attachments. They found moments of closeness in lives filled with uncertainty. They navigated expectations with creativity and endurance. This is the part history often forgets. Rules are easier to record than resilience. Laws survive longer than emotions. But beneath the restrictions, people remained human. They desired. They connected. They made mistakes. They repeated them. And slowly, quietly, without ceremony, the medieval world moved forward, carrying its contradictions with it. The medieval understanding of sex was shaped less by experience and more by inheritance. Ideas passed down from earlier centuries carried weight simply because they were old. Authority mattered more than accuracy. If a respected figure had said something centuries ago, it was treated as truth even if daily life quietly contradicted it. This created a gap between doctrine and reality that most people learned to live inside without ever trying to resolve it. Silence filled that gap. Silence was safer than questions. Asking questions suggested curiosity, and curiosity suggested intent. Intent was dangerous. So people learned by watching, by listening, by absorbing fragments of information without context. Knowledge arrived incomplete and often too late. When mistakes happened, they were treated as moral failures rather than predictable outcomes of ignorance. The body itself was a source of suspicion. Physical sensations were not trusted. Pleasure was especially unreliable. It distracted from prayer, from labor, from obedience. The idea that the body might want something the soul did not was deeply unsettling. Rather than reconcile the two, medieval culture chose hierarchy. The soul was elevated. The body was restrained. This did not eliminate desire. It reframed it as a test. Every urge became an opportunity to fail or resist. This made daily life exhausting. Desire was constant. Resistance required attention. Attention required energy. Most people failed quietly and repented later. Repentance was part of the system. It allowed pressure to release without dismantling authority. You sinned. You confessed. You were forgiven. You tried again. This cycle normalized failure while preserving rules. It did not aim to prevent sin completely. It aimed to manage it. The Church's interest in sex was not purely moral, it was administrative. Regulating intimacy meant regulating inheritance, legitimacy, alliances, and population. Sex determined who belonged where. Children needed fathers. Property needed heirs. Marriage created stability. Unregulated desire threatened all of this. Because of this, sexual behavior was tracked indirectly. Not through observation, but through consequences. Pregnancy revealed activity. Rumors suggested impropriety. Absence of heirs raised suspicion. Bodies became evidence. Women carried the burden of this visibility. Their bodies changed. Their reputations followed them. Men could deny. Women could not. This imbalance shaped every interaction. Modesty was demanded not for virtue, but for containment. Clothing reflected this anxiety. Coverage signaled respectability. Exposure invited judgment. Fashion shifted slowly, but moral interpretation remained strict. What you wore suggested who you were, or at least who others believed you to be. For unmarried women, purity was currency. It determined marriage prospects. It affected family honor. It existed as a concept more than a reality. Proof was impossible. Accusation was enough. This made purity both essential and fragile. Men were judged differently. Their transgressions were framed as lapses rather than identities. They were expected to struggle. Women were expected to endure. This difference was rarely questioned. It was embedded in law, theology, and custom. Sexual education, when it occurred, was functional rather than explanatory. You were told what not to do more often than what to do. You were warned of consequences rather than prepared for experiences. Fear replaced understanding. Even within marriage, communication was limited. Roles were defined. Expectations were implied. Pleasure was not discussed. Dissatisfaction was endured. Marriage was not meant to fulfill you. It was meant to stabilize you. This created space for quiet rebellion. Small acts of agency. Timing intimacy around forbidden days. Using knowledge passed between trusted hands. Laughing at sermons while nodding respectfully. Survival required flexibility. Communities enforced norms unevenly. Everyone knew who bent rules. Enforcement depended on visibility, power, and inconvenience. This inconsistency made morality feel negotiable. It was not the act that mattered most, but who witnessed it. As centuries passed, these systems hardened and softened in cycles. Reform movements tightened control. Social fatigue loosened it again. The tension never disappeared. It simply shifted focus. Eventually, new ideas emerged. Privacy increased. Literacy spread. Scientific observation challenged inherited authority. Desire was still feared, but it was no longer entirely mysterious. Sex began to move slowly from public regulation toward private experience. But in the medieval world, it remained communal property. It belonged to everyone and no one. It was judged, discussed, regulated, and misunderstood. It shaped lives quietly and constantly. People adapted not because they agreed, but because they had to. They lived inside contradictions without naming them. They navigated systems that offered rules without guidance. They carried expectations that could not be fully met. And still, they loved when they could. They desired when they dared. They endured when they had no choice. This is what history often reduces to footnotes. Not grand romance. Not endless repression. Just people doing their best inside structures that did not trust them. And as the night stretches on, as voices fade and the world grows quieter, it becomes easier to see the medieval past not as strange or distant, but as familiar in uncomfortable ways. Because the rules may change. The language may soften. But the tension between desire and control has never truly left. It has only learned new names. Over time, the medieval world learned to live with the fact that sex could not be eliminated, only shaped. Institutions stopped trying to eradicate desire and focused instead on directing it into acceptable channels. Marriage became the preferred container. It did not solve the problem, but it made it manageable. Within this container, roles were clearly defined. A husband led. A wife obeyed. These expectations extended into intimacy. Initiative belonged to men. Compliance belonged to women. This division was presented as natural, divinely ordered, and therefore unquestionable. Whether it reflected reality mattered less than whether it preserved hierarchy. Language reinforced this structure. Sex was described using metaphors of duty, debt, and obligation. A spouse owed intimacy the way one owed labor or loyalty. Refusal could be framed as denial of rightful access. Consent, as understood today, did not exist as a separate concept. Agreement was assumed once marriage occurred. This assumption erased nuance. It left little room for individual experience. Pleasure was irrelevant. Discomfort was secondary. The act mattered more than how it felt. Yet even inside these constraints, human variation persisted. Some couples found mutual affection. Some negotiated quietly. Some avoided intimacy when they could. Others accepted it as routine, neither feared nor cherished. The Church acknowledged marital sex as necessary but remained uneasy with it. Clerics warned against excess even within marriage. Too much intimacy suggested indulgence. Too little suggested failure. The ideal was balance, though balance was never precisely defined. This ambiguity served authority well. When ideals are unclear, correction is always possible. Everyone could be reminded they were doing it wrong, just not wrong enough to be excluded entirely. Sexual guilt became a background hum. It did not require active wrongdoing. It existed simply because desire existed. People learned to carry it without noticing, like a low-level ache. Confession normalized this state. Regular acknowledgement of failure created a rhythm. Sin was expected. Forgiveness was available. The cycle continued. This structure offered psychological relief. You were not uniquely flawed. Everyone struggled. Everyone failed. The system did not collapse because of failure. It absorbed it. Outside official doctrine, folklore offered alternative explanations. Stories circulated about love, betrayal, desire, and consequence. These tales reflected lived experience more closely than sermons. They acknowledged attraction, jealousy, curiosity. They offered caution without condemnation. Songs and stories allowed exploration of forbidden feelings in symbolic form. This made them safe. Art carried what speech could not. Physical spaces reflected attitudes toward intimacy. Bedrooms were not private sanctuaries. They were shared spaces, sometimes multifunctional. The idea of retreating alone with one's partner was rare. Intimacy occurred within earshot of daily life. This lack of privacy shaped behavior. Silence mattered. Timing mattered. Discretion mattered. Intimacy was brief, practical, and often interrupted. For the wealthy, space increased but surveillance did not disappear. Servants observed. Reputation traveled. Privacy was a privilege, but never complete. For the poor, survival overshadowed desire. Labor consumed energy. Hunger dulled appetite. Intimacy happened when exhaustion allowed. Romance was a luxury few could afford. Despite this, desire persisted across classes. It was not eradicated by hardship. It adapted to it. It found moments between obligations. Religious life offered an alternative. Celibacy was praised as spiritual discipline. Monastic communities removed individuals from marital expectations. This path was idealized, but not always realistic. Celibacy did not eliminate desire. It reframed it as temptation. Struggle became proof of devotion. Failure became spiritual drama. Records show that sexual activity existed within religious institutions despite vows. The same rules applied. Silence, confession, repetition. This repetition reveals something important. Medieval society did not expect perfection. It expected management. Control was aspirational, not absolute. Over generations, attitudes shifted slowly. Economic changes altered family structures. Urbanization increased anonymity. New ideas circulated. Authority weakened in places. Sex began to loosen its ties to public regulation. Privacy increased. Individual experience gained weight. But in the medieval period itself, sex remained deeply embedded in social order. It was not an expression of self. It was a function of structure. Looking back, it is tempting to judge this harshly. The lack of autonomy. The imbalance of power. The fear surrounding something so basic. Yet within these constraints, people lived full lives. They adapted emotionally. They formed attachments. They navigated expectations with quiet intelligence. History preserves laws and doctrines because they are written. It rarely preserves compromise, negotiation, or resilience. These exist in the spaces between records. Sex in medieval times was not one thing. It was obligation and desire, fear and familiarity, control and adaptation. It was shaped by rules and reshaped by people. And as the centuries moved forward, these tensions did not vanish. They transformed. They softened in places. They hardened in others. What remains consistent is the human effort to reconcile desire with order, intimacy with expectation, pleasure with responsibility. That effort did not begin in the modern world. It did not begin with freedom. It began long before, in rooms without privacy, under rules without clarity, carried quietly by people doing their best. And as this long night continues, as thought drifts and attention fades, it becomes easier to let go of the distance between then and now. Because the medieval world may feel unfamiliar, but its struggles are not. They are simply wearing older clothes that as time passed, the rules surrounding sex became so familiar that many people stopped noticing them. They blended into daily life, reinforced through habit rather than reflection. You did not wake up each morning thinking about doctrine. You woke up thinking about work, weather, food, and survival. The rules were simply there, shaping decisions quietly in the background. This quiet presence made them powerful. When something feels inevitable, it is rarely questioned. Sex was framed not as a choice but as a condition. Something that had to be managed correctly, like fire or illness. Useful when controlled, destructive when left alone. This framing encouraged caution. It discouraged curiosity. Curiosity suggested indulgence. Indulgence suggested moral weakness. Weakness invited judgment. Judgment was rarely abstract. It came from neighbors, family, employers, and clergy. Communities were small. Privacy was limited. Reputation traveled faster than truth. Once attached, it was difficult to remove. Because of this, behavior was shaped not only by belief, but by observation. What mattered was not what you felt, but what others believed you felt. Appearance mattered more than intention. Performance mattered more than honesty. This led to careful presentation. People learned how to look respectable. They learned when to speak and when to remain silent. They learned which behaviors attracted scrutiny and which passed unnoticed. Sexual behavior followed these patterns. What happened behind closed doors mattered less than what could be seen, heard, or suspected. Discretion was a skill. Those who mastered it avoided consequences. Those who did not became examples served a purpose. Public punishment reinforced boundaries. Shame functioned as deterrence. The lesson was not subtle. Conform or be visible, yet even within this structure, exceptions existed. Rules bent for the powerful. Status softened consequences. Wealth absorbed scandal. The same behavior could be ignored or punished depending on who committed it. This inconsistency did not weaken authority. It strengthened it. Unpredictability discouraged resistance. When outcomes are uncertain, caution increases. Children grew up absorbing these lessons indirectly. They watched adults navigate rules without explanation. They learned what was risky by observing reactions. No one explained desire. They explained consequences. This left young people unprepared. Puberty arrived with confusion rather than understanding. Bodily changes were alarming. Curiosity was met with silence or warning. Ignorance became a form of control. Marriage resolved some uncertainty but introduced new constraints. It provided legitimacy but limited freedom. It offered permission but removed choice. Once married, sex was no longer forbidden, but it was no longer negotiable either. Obligation replaced prohibition. The emotional experience remained secondary. This arrangement worked best when expectations aligned. When they did not, endurance filled the gap. People learned to tolerate dissatisfaction quietly. Complaints were discouraged. Endurance was praised. Pleasure existed, but it was not central. It was incidental. Something that happened sometimes, unexpectedly. It was not pursued openly or discussed easily. This does not mean medieval people were joyless. It means joy was not the organizing principle. Stability was. Sex was folded into this priority. It served continuity, lineage, and labor. Individual fulfillment was optional. Over time, stories preserved what rules could not capture. Folktales, songs, and whispered jokes acknowledged desire without naming it directly. Humor softened fear. Metaphor created distance. Laughter allowed release. It acknowledged shared experience without challenging authority. Everyone understood. No one admitted it. This quiet understanding bound communities together. Shared silence became shared knowledge. Rules existed, but so did ways around them. People learned when to comply and when to adapt. They balanced expectation with survival. They navigated systems that were rigid on paper and flexible in practice. As centuries moved forward, change crept in slowly. Economic shifts altered family structures. Urban life increased anonymity. Authority became less personal. Sex gradually retreated from communal oversight into more private spaces. This shift was uneven and incomplete, but noticeable. Still, in the medieval world, sex remained deeply social. It reflected hierarchy, belief, fear, and necessity. It was never just about bodies. It was about order. Understanding this helps explain the intensity with which it was regulated. Sex touched everything. Property, inheritance, labor, faith. It could not be ignored. And so it was managed carefully, imperfectly, and often unfairly. Looking back, it is easy to focus on restriction. But restriction tells only part of the story. Adaptation fills the rest. People lived within limits they did not design. They found ways to express humanity inside structures that resisted it. They made compromises. They endured contradictions. Sex in medieval times was not defined by a single experience. It varied across regions, classes, and individuals. It was shaped by rule and reshaped by necessity. What remains constant is the effort to reconcile desire with expectation. That effort has never disappeared. It continues, changing language and context, but retaining familiar tension. As the night stretches on and thought drifts, the medieval world begins to feel less distant. Not because its rules resemble ours, but because its people do. They worried. They adapted. They sought connection where they could. And in that quiet persistence, history becomes less about difference and more about continuity. The continuity of these experiences is what makes them linger. Even when the structures surrounding sex shifted, the habits of thought remained. Ideas about propriety, restraint, and expectation traveled slowly, carried forward by tradition rather than enforced all at once. Change did not arrive suddenly. It crept in quietly, often unnoticed by the people living through it. In the medieval period, sex was never isolated from consequence. It was always attached to something else. Reputation, inheritance, obligation, or fear. Rarely was it allowed to exist on its own terms. This attachment shaped how people thought about themselves. Desire became something to explain, justify, or excuse, rather than simply experience. This produced a careful internal language. People learned how to think about their own impulses in ways that aligned with acceptable narratives. Desire could be framed as temptation. Fulfillment could be framed as duty. Dissatisfaction could be framed as endurance. Words mattered. They shaped understanding. The absence of a neutral vocabulary made honesty difficult. If every description carried judgment, then silence was safer. Silence became common. Silence became normal. In this environment, imagination took on a special role. Fantasy existed where action could not. It was safer to imagine than to act. Stories allowed desire to exist without consequence. Poetry created distance. Allegory softened reality. This is why medieval literature often appears obsessed with longing rather than fulfillment. Longing was safe. Fulfillment was complicated. Desire could be admired as long as it remained unconsummated. This preserved virtue while acknowledging feeling. When desire crossed into action, it became harder to manage. Action created evidence. Evidence created consequences. So desire was often kept suspended, admired but restrained. This suspension shaped emotional lives. It encouraged patience. It encouraged endurance. It discouraged expectation. Expectation was dangerous. Expecting satisfaction invited disappointment. Better to accept what came quietly and without demand. Marriage institutionalized this philosophy. It promised stability, not happiness. It offered legitimacy, not fulfillment. People entered it with practical hopes rather than romantic ones. When affection developed, it was welcomed but not required. When it did not, endurance filled the space. Sex within marriage followed this pattern. It was regular but not central. Necessary but not celebrated. It existed alongside labor, illness, and routine. Over time, familiarity dulled anxiety. What was once feared became habitual. Habit replaced reflection. This does not mean discomfort disappeared. It means it was normalized. Pain, dissatisfaction, and imbalance were expected. They were not interpreted as failure. They were interpreted as life. Outside marriage, sex carried heavier weight. Illegitimacy disrupted inheritance. Scandal disrupted community order. The consequences were disproportionate. This encouraged secrecy. Secrecy encouraged risk. Risk encouraged punishment. And yet, people continued. Rules did not eliminate behavior. They shaped it. Those who navigated these systems successfully did so through discretion rather than defiance. Open rebellion was rare. Quiet adaptation was common. This adaptation required social intelligence. Knowing when to speak, when to remain silent, when to conform, and when to bend. These skills mattered more than belief. Belief could be flexible. Survival could not. As generations passed, these patterns embedded themselves deeply. They became tradition. Tradition became identity. People inherited not only rules, but the emotional posture required to live under them. Caution. Modesty. Restraint. Even when formal authority weakened, these postures remained. They shaped expectations long after the original rules faded. This is why medieval attitudes toward sex echo into later periods. They left traces. They influenced norms. They shaped language. Understanding this helps explain why modern discomfort sometimes mirrors ancient anxiety. The context changes, but the emotional inheritance lingers. Sex has always been more than physical interaction. It has always been a site of meaning. Control over it meant control over society. In the medieval world, that control was visible, explicit, and institutional. It shaped daily life. People lived within it not because they agreed, but because they had to. They adapted. They endured. And as the night deepens, as attention softens, it becomes easier to see these patterns not as distant history, but as foundations. They remind us that human experience rarely aligns neatly with the systems built around it. There is always tension. There is always negotiation. The medieval world was no exception. It was simply honest about its fear. And fear, once embedded, is slow to leave. Fear shaped not only rules, but memory. The medieval world remembered sex selectively. It recorded transgressions more often than tenderness. Laws survived longer than emotions. Sermons outlasted quiet moments between people who never wrote anything down. What we inherit is therefore incomplete, weighted toward control rather than experience. This imbalance can make the past feel harsher than it was, though harshness certainly existed. It can also hide how ordinary intimacy actually was. People still formed bonds. They still sought comfort. They still found familiarity in one another amid uncertainty. These moments rarely entered records because they did not disrupt order. Normality is historically invisible. What survives instead are moments of conflict. Scandals. Trials. Punishments. Warnings. These give the impression that sex was always a problem, always contested, always dangerous. In truth, it was simply significant. Anything tied so closely to survival and structure could never be neutral. Medieval people understood this instinctively. They influenced norms. They shaped language. Understanding this helps explain why modern discomfort sometimes mirrors ancient anxiety. The context changes, but the emotional inheritance lingers. Sex has always been more than physical interaction. It has always been a site of meaning. Control over it meant control over society. In the medieval world, that control was visible, explicit, and institutional. It shaped daily life. People lived within it not because they agreed, but because they had to. They adapted. They endured. And as the night deepens, as attention softens, it becomes easier to see these patterns not as distant history, but as foundations. They remind us that human experience rarely aligns neatly with the systems built around it. There is always tension. There is always negotiation. The medieval world was no exception. It was simply honest about its fear. And fear, once embedded, is slow to leave. Fear shaped not only rules, but memory. The medieval world remembered sex selectively. It recorded transgressions more often than tenderness. Laws survived longer than emotions. Sermons outlasted quiet moments between people who never wrote anything down. What we inherit is therefore incomplete, weighted toward control rather than experience. This imbalance can make the past feel harsher than it was, though harshness certainly existed. It can also hide how ordinary intimacy actually was. People still formed bonds. They still sought comfort. They still found familiarity in one another amid uncertainty. These moments rarely entered records because they did not disrupt order. Normality is historically invisible. What survives instead are moments of conflict. Scandals. Trials. Punishments. Warnings. These give the impression that sex was always a problem, always contested, always dangerous. In truth, it was simply significant. Anything tied so closely to survival and structure could never be neutral. Medieval people understood this instinctively. They did not analyze it the way modern historians do. They lived it. They navigated expectations through habit rather than theory. This meant that attitudes varied widely from place to place. Rural communities often enforced norms differently than cities. Families developed their own customs. What was tolerated in one village might be condemned in another. Authority was not uniform. It was negotiated daily. Local clergy mattered more than distant doctrine. A forgiving priest could soften rules. A strict one could intensify them. Personality influenced morality more than official texts ever admitted. This variability created pockets of relative freedom and pockets of intense control. People learned the boundaries of their environment through experience. They adapted accordingly. Travel disrupted this familiarity. Moving to a new region meant relearning expectations. What was acceptable behavior in one place could become scandalous elsewhere. This made migration risky, especially for women. Sexual reputation did not travel easily. It could be reshaped, but also distorted. Rumor filled gaps. Identity became fragile. This fragility reinforced caution. Better to remain known than to risk reinvention. Stability outweighed opportunity. Within these constraints, humor played an important role. Jokes allowed people to acknowledge contradiction without confronting it directly. Sexual humor existed everywhere, often crude, often exaggerated. It acknowledged desire while maintaining distance. Laughter reduced tension. It created community. It allowed shared recognition of what could not be openly discussed. This humor coexisted with strict morality. The contradiction was not resolved. It was lived with. Festivals provided temporary release. Certain times of year allowed loosened behavior. Rules relaxed briefly. Excess was tolerated. These moments acted as pressure valves. They did not challenge authority. They reinforced it by contrast. Afterward, order returned. Normal expectations resumed. The release made restraint feel bearable again. This cycle of control and release was essential. Without it, systems fracture. Medieval society understood this intuitively. Sex fit into this rhythm. Mostly regulated. Occasionally loosened. Always significant. The idea of personal fulfillment through intimacy was not absent, but it was secondary. Survival came first. Stability followed. Fulfillment was optional. This hierarchy shaped emotional lives. People learned to find meaning in endurance. They valued reliability over intensity. Consistency over passion. This does not mean passion did not exist. It means it was not central to identity. It was experienced privately, not celebrated publicly. Modern perspectives often struggle with this. We are accustomed to treating desire as self-defining. The medieval world treated it as disruptive. Neither approach is entirely comfortable. Each carries its own tensions. Understanding the medieval approach helps contextualize its fears. When survival is uncertain, unpredictability becomes threatening. Sex introduces unpredictability. It creates new lives. New obligations. New complications. Control felt necessary. As time moved forward and conditions stabilized, control slowly loosened. But the emotional residue remained. This residue appears in later moral systems, in language, in inherited discomfort. It lingers in the way societies continue to negotiate intimacy. The medieval world did not invent sexual anxiety. It organized it. And that organization shaped centuries of thought. As the night continues and attention drifts, it becomes easier to let these ideas settle without judgment. To see them as responses rather than failures. As attempts to manage complexity with limited tools. People did not know what we know now. They worked with what they had. Fear. Faith. Tradition. They built systems that constrained and protected simultaneously. They caused harm and stability at once. Sex sat at the center of this paradox. Necessary. Feared. Regulated. Desired. It was never resolved. And perhaps that is the most consistent thread across history. The inability to resolve it fully. The medieval world lived inside that tension quietly, for generations, without expecting an answer. Time moved forward slowly in the medieval world, and with it, habits hardened. When something remains unchanged for long enough, it stops feeling imposed and starts feeling natural. Sexual norms reached this state. They were no longer experienced as rules that came from somewhere else. They felt like the way things simply were. This is how systems become invisible. People stop noticing them until they encounter a boundary. Those boundaries appeared most clearly during moments of crisis. Illness, famine, war, and death all brought sex into sharper focus. During plagues, moral anxiety intensified. Desire was blamed. Excess was suspected. Bodies became symbols of disorder. Restrictions tightened, not because they worked, but because fear demanded action. When death was close, the body became suspect. Pleasure felt inappropriate. Survival reframed priorities. In these moments, sex was treated as indulgence, something to be postponed until stability returned. Stability rarely did. War disrupted norms differently. Soldiers traveled, communities shifted, families fractured, rules loosened at the edges. Authority struggled to follow movement. Temporary relationships formed. Long separations altered expectations. The system bent under pressure. Afterward, order attempted to reassert itself. New rules appeared. Old ones were restated with renewed intensity. The pattern repeated. Sex responded to circumstance as much as doctrine. It was shaped by scarcity and abundance, fear and relief. People adapted without announcing it. Widowhood revealed another layer. Marriage ended abruptly. Remarriage was encouraged for practical reasons. Emotional transitions were rarely acknowledged. Grief existed alongside necessity. A widow's sexuality was tightly controlled. She was expected to mourn, then remarry appropriately, or withdraw from intimacy entirely. Too much independence was suspicious. Too little made survival difficult. Older age altered expectations as well. Desire did not vanish, but visibility decreased. Sexuality became less monitored, not because it was accepted, but because it was no longer considered threatening. Power follows fertility. This reveals another truth. Sexual regulation was never just about morality. It was about reproduction, inheritance, and control. Once those were no longer at stake, interest faded. Children born outside marriage complicated everything. Illegitimacy affected status. It altered futures. It exposed private behavior. Responsibility fell unevenly. Mothers bore the consequences. Fathers often escaped them. This imbalance was normalized. It reflected broader structures of power. Communities responded with mixed strategies. Some absorbed children quietly. Others marked them permanently. Compassion and cruelty coexisted without contradiction. Throughout all of this, sex remained persistent. It did not recede under pressure. It adapted. It hid. It waited. The gap between ideal and reality widened, but rarely broke. People lived within it because they had no alternative. Language continued to evolve around this tension. Euphemisms multiplied. Direct speech remained rare. Indirection became art. This indirectness shaped thought itself. When something cannot be named easily, it becomes harder to examine. Complexity is flattened. Myths persist. Many medieval beliefs about sex survive not because they were accurate, but because they were never challenged openly. Silence preserved them. It would take centuries for new frameworks to emerge. For anatomy to replace allegory. For consent to become a concept. For privacy to become expectation. Even then, echoes remained. The medieval world did not disappear. It dissolved gradually, leaving fragments embedded in new systems. Old fears took on new language. Old rules found new justifications. Sex remained a focal point because it always touches the most sensitive parts of society. Power. Identity. Continuity. What medieval society feared was not sex itself, but what it represented. Uncertainty. Change. Loss of control. In that sense, its anxiety was rational, even if its solutions were flawed. People did not live in constant repression. They lived in constant negotiation. They balanced expectation with impulse, survival with desire. They learned where flexibility existed. They learned where it did not. These lessons were passed down informally. Through observation. Through warning. Through example. This is how culture persists. As the hours stretch and the mind drifts, these patterns blur into something familiar. Not because they are identical to modern experience, but because the underlying questions remain. How much control is necessary? How much freedom is dangerous? Where responsibility ends and desire begins. The medieval world answered these questions differently, but it asked the same ones. And it lived with the answers, even when they were uncomfortable. It did not seek resolution. It sought continuity. And in that quiet persistence, it left a legacy that still hums beneath modern thought, barely noticed, but rarely absent. As continuity stretched across centuries, repetition softened sharp edges. What once felt heavy became routine. People stopped questioning why things were arranged the way they were and focused instead on how to live within those arrangements. This shift from questioning to coping defined much of medieval emotional life. Coping did not require belief. It required familiarity. Children absorbed expectations early. They learned what was spoken and what was avoided. They learned which questions were answered and which were redirected. Silence taught as much as instruction. By the time desire appeared, it already had a framework waiting for it. This framework shaped first experiences. Curiosity was present, but often mixed with confusion. Information came unevenly, through peers, observation, or implication rather than guidance. Knowledge was partial. Assumptions filled the gaps. Because clarity was rare, misunderstanding was common. Many ideas about the body were symbolic rather than anatomical. Explanations relied on metaphor. This made experience difficult to interpret. Pleasure, discomfort, and expectation did not always align. When experience contradicted belief, belief usually remained intact. Individuals adjusted their interpretation rather than the framework itself. Personal confusion did not become collective revision. This preserved stability at the cost of understanding. For those who entered religious life, sex became something to renounce publicly, even if desire persisted privately. Celibacy was praised, but not always effortless. The ideal was elevated precisely because it was difficult. Struggle was reframed as virtue. Suppression became discipline. This allowed desire to exist without invalidating the system. The presence of temptation reinforced the value of resistance. This logic appeared throughout society. Difficulty validated the rule. If something was hard to control, it must be important to control it. Women bore a particular burden within this reasoning. Their bodies were viewed as thresholds. Gateways to lineage, honor, and disorder. Control over women's sexuality became symbolic control over the future. This symbolism narrowed options. Visibility increased scrutiny. Behavior was interpreted through assumption rather than evidence. Reputation could outweigh reality. Men faced expectations too, but with greater flexibility. Transgression was often framed as weakness rather than threat. The consequences differed. These asymmetries were rarely questioned openly. They were justified through tradition, theology, and perceived necessity. Power explained itself. Despite this, everyday life created exceptions. Relationships formed that did not fit ideals. Compromises emerged quietly. People prioritized peace over purity when needed. Communities adjusted without announcing it. They absorbed contradictions and moved on. This adaptability is often overlooked. Medieval society was rigid in theory but flexible in practice. Survival required it. As time passed, economic changes altered intimacy. Urbanization created anonymity. Guilds and trades reshaped household structures. New rhythms emerged. Privacy increased slowly. Not enough to create modern notions, but enough to soften constant oversight. Doors closed more often. Shared spaces changed function. With privacy came new emotional awareness. People noticed themselves more. Desire felt more personal, less purely social. This shift was subtle. It did not overturn old systems, but it introduced tension. Inner life expanded while external rules remained. That tension would later fuel transformation. For now, it remained contained. Medieval people did not imagine a future of sexual freedom or repression. They imagined continuity. Tomorrow was expected to resemble today. Change was incremental, not revolutionary. This expectation shaped patience. People endured because endurance was normal. They did not wait for liberation. They waited for seasons. Sex fit into this cycle. It was part of life, not its center. It followed rhythms of work, health, and age. It rose and receded without commentary. This ordinariness is easy to forget. History highlights conflict, but most days passed quietly. Most lives unfolded without record. Intimacy happened in those unrecorded spaces. Between tasks. Between worries. Between generations. What remains is not a single medieval attitude toward sex, but a layered one. Fear and familiarity. Control and adaptation. Silence and persistence. It was never resolved. It was managed. And management, over time, becomes culture. As the mind slows and attention softens, these layers settle into one another. They stop demanding judgment. They simply exist as part of a long human pattern. People have always lived between impulse and structure. The medieval world did so with the tools it had. Those tools shaped lives quietly, day after day, for centuries. And when one era faded into the next, it did not disappear. It folded into what came after, carrying its questions forward. Still unanswered. As centuries overlapped, the medieval sense of intimacy became less about doctrine and more about rhythm. Life itself moved in cycles, work and rest, hunger and harvest, illness and recovery, and sex followed those same patterns. It was rarely constant. It ebbed and returned according to circumstance. This reduced urgency. Desire did not demand immediate satisfaction. It could wait. Waiting was familiar. Everything required waiting. This patience shaped emotional endurance. People learned to live with unmet needs without naming them as unmet. Lack was normalized. Fulfillment was intermittent. Expectation adjusted accordingly. This is one of the quiet differences between medieval and modern inner life. Today, dissatisfaction often signals something wrong. Then, it signaled something ordinary. The body was not treated as a project to optimize. It was treated as a condition to manage. Pleasure existed, but it was not maximized. It was accepted when it appeared and endured when it did not. This acceptance softened disappointment. It also limited exploration. Without language, without permission, curiosity remained shallow. Most people experienced what was familiar and stopped there. This familiarity extended to physical closeness itself. Touch was not rare. Crowded spaces, shared labor, communal sleeping arrangements meant bodies were always near one another. Physical presence was constant even when intimacy was regulated. This proximity reduced mystery. Bodies were known in practical ways. Illness, injury, childbirth, and aging were visible. The body was not idealized. It was observed. This realism tempered fantasy. Desire was grounded in what was seen daily. It was less abstract, more immediate. At the same time, emotional privacy was limited. Thoughts were shared selectively. Silence protected interior life. People carried much unspoken. This silence did not mean emptiness. It meant compression. Feelings were condensed rather than expressed. Over time, this created depth without articulation. Medieval emotional life was often deep but narrow. Intense within small ranges. Loyal, persistent, restrained. Sexual bonds reflected this. Attachment formed through continuity rather than novelty. Familiarity mattered more than excitement. This explains why betrayal was so destabilizing. It disrupted not only trust, but rhythm. It introduced unpredictability into systems built on repetition. Punishment for betrayal focused on restoration of order rather than emotional harm. The priority was stability, not healing. Healing happened privately, if at all. Religious confession offered one outlet. It allowed private acknowledgement without public disruption. It translated desire into moral language. This made it manageable. Confession did not erase behavior. It reframed it. It offered narrative closure where reality could not. This narrative mattered. It allowed people to continue without rupture. Life moved on. Over time, these practices shaped conscience itself. Guilt became internalized. Surveillance moved inward. People monitored themselves. This internal monitoring reduced the need for constant enforcement. Power became subtle. Compliance became habitual. Sexual restraint became less about fear of punishment and more about identity. One behaved a certain way because that was who one was. Identity hardened around these norms. Deviance felt not just risky, but alien. This proximity reduced mystery. Bodies were known in practical ways. Illness, injury, childbirth, and aging were visible. The body was not idealized. It was observed. This realism tempered fantasy. Desire was grounded in what was seen daily. It was less abstract, more immediate. At the same time, emotional privacy was limited. Thoughts were shared selectively. Silence protected interior life. People carried much unspoken. This silence did not mean emptiness. It meant compression. Feelings were condensed rather than expressed. Over time, this created depth without articulation. Medieval emotional life was often deep but narrow. Intense within small ranges. Loyal, persistent, restrained. Sexual bonds reflected this. Attachment formed through continuity rather than novelty. Familiarity mattered more than excitement. This explains why betrayal was so destabilizing. It disrupted not only trust, but rhythm. It introduced unpredictability into systems built on repetition. Punishment for betrayal focused on restoration of order rather than emotional harm. The priority was stability, not healing. Healing happened privately, if at all. Religious confession offered one outlet. It allowed private acknowledgement without public disruption. It translated desire into moral language. This made it manageable. Confession did not erase behavior. It reframed it. It offered narrative closure where reality could not. This narrative mattered. It allowed people to continue without rupture. Life moved on. Over time, these practices shaped conscience itself. Guilt became internalized. Surveillance moved inward. People monitored themselves. This internal monitoring reduced the need for constant enforcement. Power became subtle. Compliance became habitual. Sexual restraint became less about fear of punishment and more about identity. One behaved a certain way because that was who one was. Identity hardened around these norms. Deviance felt not just risky, but alien. Yet deviation never vanished. It existed quietly, persistently. Systems absorbed it without collapsing. This balance between rigidity and flexibility sustained medieval society longer than is often acknowledged. It was not fragile. It was adaptive. Sex was one of the pressures it learned to absorb. As centuries approached transition, new influences appeared. Trade brought new ideas. Texts circulated slowly. Medical knowledge shifted. Philosophy changed emphasis. But change arrived layered over the old, not replacing it. New interpretations coexisted with inherited fear. People carried contradictions without resolving them. They always had. This capacity to live with contradiction may be one of the medieval world's most enduring traits. As attention drifts and the narrative continues, these patterns blur into something almost familiar. Not because they are comfortable, but because they are human. Every society negotiates desire within limits. The medieval world did so with patience rather than urgency. It did not ask what sex could be. It asked what could be endured. And endurance shaped everything. The night lengthens. Thought slows. The past feels less distant. Lives lived quietly, without record, without resolution, come into view. They did not seek to understand sex as a concept. They lived it as a condition. And then they slept as sleep deepens, the mind begins to notice how little of history is made of events, and how much of it is made of repetition. The medieval world repeated itself daily. Wake, work, eat, rest. Within that repetition, sex did not stand apart. It was folded into the ordinary, shaped by fatigue as much as desire. Tired bodies behaved differently than idle ones. Physical labor dulled urgency. At the end of long days, intimacy was often quiet, brief, unremarkable. This did not mean it was meaningless. It meant it was grounded. There was little separation between emotional closeness and practical dependence. Partnership was built through shared survival. Sex reinforced that bond, but it did not define it. Love, when it existed, grew slowly. It was not declared early. It emerged through reliability. Through presence. Through shared endurance. This kind of love was not dramatic. It did not demand attention. It settled in quietly. Because of this, sexual intimacy was often less performative than we imagine. There was no audience, no expectation of expression. It did not need to prove anything. Bodies responded as they did. No more. No less. The absence of performance reduced pressure. It also reduced dialogue. People did not analyze experience afterward. They moved on. This lack of analysis protected simplicity. It also limited growth. Mistakes were common. Misunderstandings persisted. People adapted by repetition rather than reflection. Over time, repetition created comfort. Comfort created attachment. This attachment was not always romantic, but it was stable. Stability mattered most. Even within constraint, people found moments of tenderness. A hand resting longer than necessary. A shared glance. Familiar laughter. These moments rarely entered moral frameworks. They existed beneath them. History often misses these moments because they leave no trace. What remains are structures. Rules. Warnings. But beneath those structures lived millions of small, ordinary intimacies that never sought permission. They did not challenge authority. They simply existed. Sex was not always charged with anxiety. Much of the time, it was simply part of life's texture. Like hunger. Like sleep. Anxiety surfaced when sex threatened order. When it crossed boundaries. When it became visible. Visibility was the risk. Privacy was protection. As architectural spaces slowly changed, privacy increased. Curtains appeared. Separate rooms emerged. This altered intimacy subtly. It allowed for emotional separation. Individual thought, with that came self-awareness. Desire became something felt internally, not just relationally. This shift did not happen quickly. It layered over centuries. But it mattered. The medieval world sat at the beginning of this transition, still rooted in communal life, just beginning to glimpse interiority. Sex stood at the edge of this shift. Still regulated socially, slowly becoming personal. This tension shaped later centuries. But here, it remained unresolved. People lived without expecting resolution. They lived with what worked. When we imagine medieval sex, we often imagine extremes, repression or excess. In reality, it was moderate, constrained, and ordinary. Ordinary does not mean insignificant. It means integrated. Sex was not an identity. It was an act. Sometimes meaningful. Sometimes routine. Sometimes disappointing. Sometimes comforting. It did not need to explain who someone was. This separation protected identity. People were more than their desire. In modern life, desire often defines selfhood. In the medieval world, it was a detail. This difference shapes everything. As the narrative continues and the mind drifts further, these distinctions soften. The past stops arguing with the present. It simply rests beside it. Two ways of being human, separated by time, sharing the same impulses, managed differently. Neither solved the problem. They endured it. The medieval world endured quietly, patiently, without expecting clarity. And in that endurance, it found a kind of peace. Not happiness. Not fulfillment. But continuity. As the night stretches on, the medieval world keeps breathing at its steady, unhurried pace. Nothing rushes here. Nothing resolves cleanly. Life moves forward because it must, not because it has answers. In this world, bodies age quickly, childhood ends early. Marriage comes young. Desire is not something discovered slowly, it arrives suddenly, without instruction, and is folded into responsibility almost immediately. There is no long period of exploration. There is only adaptation. People learn through experience, not discussion. They learn what works, what doesn't, and what must simply be endured. Questions about pleasure, fulfillment, or emotional compatibility rarely surface. Not because they are unimportant, but because survival occupies the foreground. Sex fits into this pattern. It is practical before it is emotional. It follows rhythms shaped by work, weather, and exhaustion. Harvest seasons leave little energy for intimacy. Winter nights, longer and quieter, allow more closeness, more time under shared blankets, more bodies pressed together for warmth rather than passion. Cold changes behavior. It encourages proximity. It turns touch into necessity. Beds are shared not only by couples but sometimes by children, relatives, or guests. Privacy is limited. Intimacy adapts. It becomes quieter, quicker, more discreet. Desire learns to wait. Or to accept interruption. There is no sense of entitlement to sex. There is no expectation that it must happen regularly, or satisfyingly, or at all. It happens when conditions allow. This lack of entitlement shapes emotional responses. Rejection does not carry the same weight. Absence does not feel like failure. It feels like circumstance. People do not measure relationships by frequency of intimacy. They measure them by endurance. The body, meanwhile, is understood differently. Medieval medicine teaches that men and women are governed by humors, hot, cold, wet, dry. Desire is thought to rise from imbalance. Too much heat. Too much moisture. Too much blood. Sex is recommended as treatment for some conditions and discouraged for others. It is medicalized without being studied. Prescribed without being understood. Women are believed to suffer if desire is unfulfilled. Men are believed to weaken if it is excessive. These beliefs coexist without contradiction. Medical advice spreads unevenly. Most people never hear it. They rely instead on custom, observation, and rumor. Advice is passed quietly. From mother to daughter. From older men to younger. Often incomplete. Often wrong. Always confident. Mistakes are accepted as part of life. Pain is expected. Discomfort is normalized. Pleasure is not emphasized. It is acknowledged, sometimes, but rarely pursued deliberately. When pleasure occurs, it is often framed as dangerous, as tempting fate, as weakening resolve. This framing does not eliminate pleasure. It simply adds guilt to it. Guilt becomes background noise. Present, but not always loud enough to interrupt life. People learn to live with guilt the way they live with hunger or cold. It exists. It does not stop them. Religion reinforces this tension. Sermons warn against lust. Confession invites admission. Absolution resets the balance. Sin is not a permanent stain. It is a cycle. Commit. Confess. Continue. This cycle makes moral failure manageable. It also makes restraint temporary. People are not expected to be perfect. They are expected to try, fail, and return. Sex exists within this rhythm of fall and forgiveness. The Church's power lies not in eliminating desire, but in defining how it is discussed. Naming it. Categorizing it. Assigning consequence. What is named can be controlled. What remains unnamed persists quietly. Most intimacy lives in that unnamed space. Between spouses. Between lovers. Between moments stolen in barns, fields, or quiet corners of crowded homes. These moments are rarely romanticized. They are not framed as rebellion. They are simply human. Adultery happens. Affairs form. Not because passion overwhelms morality, but because proximity does. Because loneliness does. Because opportunity does. Punishment varies. Sometimes severe. Sometimes non-existent. Often dependent on status. Power reshapes morality. The powerful bend rules. The powerless absorb them. Women bear greater risk. Pregnancy makes secrecy impossible. Consequence visible. Men move more freely through error. Women carry proof. This imbalance is understood, even if it is not spoken aloud. Silence protects some. It exposes others. Despite this, desire persists. Quietly. Reliably. It does not need language. It does not require justification. It exists because bodies exist. As hours pass in this telling, the medieval world grows softer. Less defined by rules, more by repetition. Days blend. Years pass. Generations inherit habits without questioning origins. Sex becomes tradition as much as impulse. People do not imagine alternatives. They live inside what is given. This is not ignorance. It is focus. The mind rests easier when it does not imagine other lives. And so the medieval world sleeps, wakes, works, loves, and rests again. Unexamined, uninterrupted. As the hours deepen, attention drifts away from individuals and settles into patterns. Medieval life is best understood not through moments of intensity, but through what repeats quietly enough to become invisible. Morning arrives early. Light enters before comfort. Bodies rise stiff, already sore. Intimacy does not begin the day. Work does. Desire waits its turn. Throughout the day, bodies are public. Labor is shared. Space is shared. Privacy is rare. Touch is ordinary but not intimate. Hands brush in passing. Shoulders press in crowds. None of this is sexual. It is simply proximity. This constant closeness drains some of desire's urgency. When bodies are always near, longing does not sharpen the same way. Absence is what fuels fantasy, and absence is scarce. Night brings separation from work, not always from others. Sleep happens together. Heat is conserved. Breath is shared. The body relaxes into familiarity. Intimacy emerges not from build-up, but from availability. There is no long anticipation. No extended negotiation. Desire is recognized, acted upon, and set aside. People do not linger in it. This brevity does not diminish importance. It reflects efficiency. Life demands energy. Sex is one use of it, not the destination. Fatigue shapes behavior more than morality ever could. When illness enters a household, intimacy pauses. Fear overrides desire. The body becomes fragile. Touch becomes careful. Plague years alter everything. Death becomes visible. Urgency rises. Marriage accelerates. Sexual boundaries loosen and tighten simultaneously. Some cling to rules more fiercely. Others abandon restraint entirely. Both responses are attempts at control. During these times, sermons grow harsher. Warnings intensify. But behavior fragments. People do not move together. They scatter. Fear isolates. In isolation, desire becomes more internal. Fantasies grow stronger when action is limited. Guilt grows alongside them. Confession fills with admissions not of acts, but of thoughts. The church listens. The church forgives. The cycle continues. What is striking is how rarely pleasure itself is condemned. It is the loss of control that worries authorities. Pleasure suggests weakness. Weakness threatens order. Sex that follows rules is tolerated. Sex that escapes them becomes dangerous. Marriage functions as containment. It channels desire into predictable paths. It protects lineage. It stabilizes property. Within marriage, expectations are uneven. Husbands expect access. Wives expect endurance. Affection varies widely. Some marriages soften over time. Others harden. Love, when present, is subtle. It does not declare itself loudly. It appears as patience. As habit. As shared silence. Sex in these marriages reflects that tone. It is rarely passionate. It is rarely cruel. It is often neutral. Neutrality is not emptiness. It is peace. People do not chase fulfillment. They settle into adequacy. Modern ears hear this as loss. Medieval minds hear it as balance. Too much wanting disrupts life. Too little wanting dulls it. The goal is steadiness. Children arrive frequently. Pregnancy is common. Birth is dangerous. Sex carries risk always. This risk tempers indulgence. It introduces caution. Women feel this risk most sharply. Their bodies carry consequence visibly. Men move through aftermath more easily. This reality shapes female desire. It becomes quieter. More strategic. More bound to safety. Midwives become trusted figures. They know bodies. They know outcomes. Their advice carries more weight than doctrine. Knowledge flows through them quietly. Without books. Without permission. This knowledge is practical, not philosophical. It answers how, not why. The church does not fully control this space. It tolerates it because it must. Life happens in the margins of authority. As time passes, the medieval world does not evolve quickly. Change creeps. Ideas shift before habits do. Privacy increases slowly. Beds become fewer per room. Curtains appear. Doors close. With privacy comes reflection. With reflection comes comparison. People begin noticing dissatisfaction. This is not yet widespread, but it begins here. Sex moves from obligation toward experience. Slowly. Unevenly. The medieval period does not complete this transition. It initiates it. And then it ends. What remains is a world where sex is woven into survival, not separated from it. Where desire is managed, not celebrated. Where intimacy exists without explanation. As the telling continues, the past grows quieter. Less dramatic. More human. Not shocking. Not exotic. Simply different. As the hours stretch on, the rhythms of medieval life settle into focus. Work and survival dominate, and desire exists alongside them, quietly, almost peripherally. People wake, labor, eat, rest. Bodies are tools first, companions second. Pleasure, when it arises, is fleeting. Its significance is measured less by joy and more by continuity. Does it maintain life, lineage, and stability? Seasons shape intimacy. Spring brings fertility, yet also labor, planting, and planting delays intimacy. Summer heats the body, encourages proximity in fields and villages, yet work consumes daylight. Autumn's harvest allows some pause, yet fatigue tempers desire. Winter nights, long and cold, provide cover for closeness, warmth, and sometimes tender intimacy. In each case, timing dictates practice more than preference. Knowledge about bodies is practical, fragmented, often passed by word of mouth. Mothers instruct daughters in quiet whispers, older women teach younger men through observation. Rumor fills the gaps. Misunderstanding is common, but everyone acts within the constraints of what they know. Pleasure is acknowledged, sometimes enjoyed, but rarely sought deliberately. Fear of consequences tempers every action. Marriage channels desire into predictable, socially sanctioned paths. Husbands expect, wives endure, communities observe. Affection is optional. Reliability is required. Sexual acts become routine, punctuated by pregnancies that signal survival and inheritance. Birth is dangerous. Death is immediate and visible. Life does not pause for enjoyment. Outside marriage, risk rises. Illegitimate children carry social consequence. Scandal spreads quickly. Women bear the brunt. Men often evade the most direct repercussions. Yet desire persists quietly in corners, fields, and shadowed rooms. Opportunistic, discreet, but never absent. Religion frames moral understanding. Confession allows acknowledgement of desire, without overturning daily life. Sin is a cycle, action, confession, absolution, continuation. Guilt is present, but contained. Pleasure itself is rarely condemned, it is the loss of control that unsettles the system. Medical knowledge contributes to shaping intimacy. Men and women are governed by humors. Excess heat or moisture signals the need for moderation. Sexual activity is sometimes recommended, sometimes discouraged. Advice is unevenly distributed, often incomplete. Custom fills the gaps. Mistakes are expected, and pain is normalized. Despite rules, repetition governs lives more than doctrine. Continuity matters more than correctness. Generations inherit habits without questioning origins. Sex becomes tradition as much as impulse, integrated into the texture of ordinary life. It does not define identity, it exists as part of endurance. Tender moments appear quietly. A hand lingering, a shared glance, a soft laugh. They are rarely recorded, rarely moralized, but they exist. Ordinary intimacy thrives beneath the framework of regulation. The medieval world's invisible life is found not in records of sin or scandal, but in small, unremarked gestures. Privacy emerges slowly as architecture evolves. Fewer people share a room, curtains and doors appear. Reflection grows. Desire becomes more personal, less communal. Dissatisfaction, previously irrelevant, begins to register. The transition is subtle. Authority remains, but self-awareness grows. The medieval period initiates this long shift. It teaches endurance, familiarity, and the ability to live within limits. Desire is constrained but persistent. It is private but inevitable. Risk exists, but is measured. Guilt exists, but is manageable. Pleasure exists, but is rarely celebrated. Life moves forward, rhythmically, uninterrupted. Days repeat. Generations inherit practice. Identity forms within constraints. Desire continues, quietly shaping emotion, habit, and understanding. Intimacy, even when brief or flawed, binds people together. Stability outweighs indulgence. Continuity outweighs novelty. And in this quiet persistence, the medieval world endures. Desire, regulation, tenderness, endurance, all fold into daily life. The past hums softly, not to be judged, but simply observed. Patterns form. Humanity persists. The night deepens. The mind relaxes into the continuity of lived experience. As the hours deepen further, the medieval world begins to feel less distant, more like a steady rhythm, a heartbeat running quietly beneath centuries of human experience. Life unfolds in cycles, and sex, while present, is rarely the loudest note. It is threaded through work, rest, survival, and expectation, moving quietly alongside them, shaped by circumstance rather than impulse. The day begins early, as it always has. People rise with the sun or slightly before it, their bodies stiff from sleep, their minds already anticipating labor. Hunger, fatigue, and responsibility structure desire. Pleasure is a detail, sometimes accidental, sometimes fleeting. It is neither demanded nor denied, but folded into what must be done. Proximity is constant. Fields, workshops, kitchens, and living quarters place bodies near one another. Touch is ordinary, incidental, rarely intimate. Hands brush in passing. Shoulders press in crowds. Children play at feet. Labor requires closeness. The mundane body teaches lessons more effectively than any text or sermon. Awareness of bodies is practical first, emotional second, and sexual only when circumstances allow. Evening comes as work ends. Darkness falls early. Firelight fills rooms, casting long shadows. Breath and warmth are shared in communal sleeping arrangements. Desire arises quietly, often mediated by practicality, warmth, comfort, companionship, rather than passion. Beds are crowded, doors often absent, privacy limited. Intimacy becomes a matter of presence and availability, not performance or expectation. Marriage channels desire predictably. Husbands expect access. Wives negotiate endurance. Children arrive as both blessing and obligation. Every act is measured against survival and stability. Pleasure exists but is subordinate. Intimacy becomes a rhythm, not a drama, punctuated by births, illness, and daily fatigue. Outside marriage, risk multiplies. Scandal spreads quickly, illegitimate children carry visible consequence, women are most affected. Men often escape the most direct repercussions. Desire persists in shadowed rooms, barns, and secluded corners. Discretion becomes skill. Opportunism and timing shape action more than intensity of feeling. Religion frames morality. Confession allows acknowledgement of desire without public disruption. Sin is a cycle: act, confess, absolve, continue. Guilt exists, present but contained. Pleasure itself is rarely condemned, it is loss of control, of predictability, that threatens the social fabric. Medical knowledge overlays this framework. Men and women are governed by humors. Excess heat, cold, moisture, or dryness signals need for moderation. Sex is recommended for some imbalances, forbidden for others. Knowledge is uneven, passed through mothers, midwives, or observation. Rumor fills gaps. Mistakes are expected, discomfort is normal. Despite rules, repetition defines life more than doctrine. Habits harden. Generations inherit norms quietly, without question. Sex becomes tradition as much as instinct, integrated into ordinary life. It does not define identity. It exists as endurance, as part of continuity. Tenderness appears quietly. A lingering hand, a glance, a shared laugh. These gestures are rarely recorded, seldom moralized, yet they are real. They are the invisible threads holding the daily fabric of life together. The medieval world lives in these small, unremarked spaces. Privacy grows slowly. Architecture evolves. Fewer people share a single room. Curtains and doors provide separation. Reflection follows. Desire becomes internalized, more personal, less dictated by community. Dissatisfaction registers subtly. Authority persists, but awareness grows. The shift is slow, layered, uneven. This period does not resolve desire, nor does it eliminate regulation. It balances them. Survival and stability take precedence. Pleasure exists but is bounded. Guilt is present but manageable. Risk is acknowledged and measured. Intimacy is structured, yet persists quietly within the structures. Generations inherit these rhythms. Desire, regulation, endurance, and tenderness coexist, quietly shaping social norms, identity, and emotional life. Stability outweighs indulgence. Continuity outweighs novelty. Life moves forward in repetition, in rhythm, in habit. The medieval world endures quietly, persistently, without fanfare, without resolution. And as this narrative stretches onward, the mind begins to feel the patterns rather than the moments. It settles into rhythm. The medieval world is not exotic. It is human, patient, enduring, persistent. Its lives unfold in repetition, punctuated by tenderness and desire, always integrated into daily survival. As the night stretches on, the medieval world softens into patterns rather than events. Life is measured in cycles: work, rest, hunger, warmth, and the quiet presence of bodies near one another. Desire exists alongside these rhythms, rarely commanding attention, often folded into what must be endured, what must continue. Morning begins early. The body awakens stiff and fatigued. Hunger is immediate, labor is pressing. Pleasure is a detail, fleeting and often accidental. The day dictates rhythm, not longing. Desire adjusts to circumstance, never absent but never urgent. Proximity is constant. Fields, workshops, kitchens, and homes place bodies near each other. Hands brush. Shoulders press. Children play at feet. Touch is ordinary. Intimacy is subtle, incidental, often unnoticed. Desire adapts to the rules of closeness imposed by survival. Evening brings pause. Darkness falls. Firelight flickers. Warmth becomes necessity. Communal sleeping arrangements press bodies together. Privacy is limited. Intimacy arises quietly, mediated by comfort and availability rather than passion. Desire is present, but muted, shaped by the constraints of space and expectation. Marriage channels desire into predictable patterns. Husbands expect access. Wives navigate endurance. Children arrive as blessings, obligations, and markers of continuity. Pleasure exists but is secondary. Intimacy is rhythmical, practical, and sometimes tender in small, fleeting gestures: a lingering hand, a shared glance, a quiet laugh. Outside marriage, risk multiplies. Illegitimacy carries social consequence. Women bear the weight most heavily. Men move through potential scandal with greater freedom. Desire persists in shadowed corners, barns, and secluded rooms. Opportunity and timing matter more than intensity. Discretion becomes skill, secrecy is survival. Religion frames moral understanding. Confession allows acknowledgement of desire, translating private impulses into moral language. Sin is a cycle: action, confession, absolution, continuation. Guilt is present but contained. Pleasure itself is rarely condemned, the threat lies in disruption of order, loss of control, of predictability. Medical knowledge overlays this moral framework. Men and women are governed by humors: hot, cold, wet, dry. Sexual activity is sometimes prescribed, sometimes discouraged, depending on imbalance. Advice flows through mothers, midwives, observation, and rumor. Knowledge is uneven. Mistakes are expected. Discomfort is normalized. Despite rules, repetition dominates life more than doctrine. Habits harden. Generations inherit norms silently, without interrogation. Sex becomes part of tradition, integrated into daily life, not a defining identity. It exists as endurance, embedded in continuity. Tenderness emerges quietly. Small gestures, a hand lingering, a glance, shared laughter, connect people. They are rarely recorded, seldom moralized, yet they form the invisible threads that sustain communal life. Intimacy exists in these unremarked spaces, thriving beneath the structures of authority. Privacy grows slowly. Architecture evolves. Fewer people share rooms. Curtains and doors provide separation. Reflection follows. Desire becomes internalized, more personal, less dictated by communal surveillance. Dissatisfaction registers subtly, self-awareness increases. Authority persists, but awareness grows. The medieval period does not resolve desire or eliminate regulation. It balances them. Survival and stability dominate. Pleasure exists within limits. Guilt is present but manageable. Risk is acknowledged and controlled. Intimacy persists quietly within these boundaries. Generations inherit these rhythms. Desire, regulation, endurance, and tenderness coexist, shaping social norms, identity, and emotional life. Stability outweighs indulgence. Continuity outweighs novelty. Life moves forward in repetition, in rhythm, in habit. The medieval world endures quietly, persistently, without fanfare, without resolution. Its people do not expect clarity or liberation. They expect survival, continuity, and the small comforts of everyday life. Even the most intimate acts, sex, tenderness, companionship, are woven into this endurance. They are not central, but they are vital. They remind that humanity persists within constraint, that pleasure and survival coexist, and that continuity is its own quiet reward. And as the hours advance, the mind begins to settle into rhythm. Patterns become more apparent than individual actions. Life moves with a patient cadence. Desire, regulation, endurance, and tenderness blend into the texture of daily existence. The medieval world is neither exotic nor strange. It is patient. It is enduring. It is human. As the hours stretch further, the medieval world becomes a landscape of rhythms rather than events. Time is marked by rising and setting sun, by labor and rest, by seasons and cycles. Desire, including sexual desire, exists alongside these rhythms, neither commanding attention nor disappearing entirely. It is threaded quietly into everyday life, shaped by circumstance, habit, and necessity. Morning begins with routine. Bodies wake stiff and weary, conditioned by labor, hunger, and the rhythms of survival. Pleasure is incidental, fleeting, and often subordinate to duty. Desire adjusts, patient and persistent, never urgent but never absent. Life itself shapes longing more than impulse, proximity is constant. People move, work, and live in shared spaces. Hands brush in passing. Shoulders press against one another in crowded homes, fields, or workshops. Children play at feet. Touch is ordinary, practical. Intimacy arises only when circumstance allows, and it is often subtle, discreet, and shaped by the constraints of survival. Evening brings a pause from labor, though not always from activity. Darkness falls early. Fires are lit. Rooms are small. Heat is shared, sometimes pressing bodies together for warmth. Privacy is limited, and intimacy is often quiet, mediated more by proximity and availability than by passion. Desire is present, subdued, integrated into practical concerns. Marriage structures desire predictably. Husbands expect access. Wives navigate endurance. Children arrive as blessings, obligations, and markers of continuity. Pleasure exists but is subordinate. Intimacy is measured, rhythmic, shaped by habit, and sometimes expressed in fleeting gestures, a lingering hand, a shared glance, a whispered laugh. Outside marriage, risk increases. Illegitimate children carry social consequences. Women bear the weight most heavily. Men evade scrutiny more easily. Desire persists quietly in shadowed corners, barns, and secluded rooms. Opportunity and timing matter more than intensity. Discretion is essential, secrecy is survival. Religion overlays morality onto these behaviors. Confession allows acknowledgement of desire, translating private impulses into moral language. Sin becomes cyclical: act, confess, absolve, continue. Guilt is present but contained. Pleasure itself is rarely condemned, the real threat lies in disruption of order, in loss of control, in deviation from expectation. Medical knowledge reinforces social regulation. Men and women are understood through humors: hot, cold, wet, dry. Sexual activity is sometimes recommended, sometimes discouraged, depending on perceived balance. Advice is fragmented, passed through mothers, midwives, and observation. Rumor fills the gaps. Mistakes are expected, discomfort is normalized. Despite rules, repetition dominates life more than doctrine. Habits harden, generations inherit norms quietly, without questioning origins. Sex becomes tradition as much as instinct, integrated into daily life, not a defining identity. It exists as endurance, embedded within continuity. Tenderness emerges quietly. Small gestures, a lingering hand, a shared glance, laughter at a private joke, connect people. These gestures are rarely recorded, seldom moralized, yet they sustain life and social cohesion. Intimacy thrives in these unremarked spaces, quietly negotiating between desire and duty, pleasure and survival. Privacy increases gradually. Architecture evolves. Fewer people share rooms. Curtains and doors provide separation. Reflection grows. Desire becomes internalized, more personal, less dictated by communal observation. Dissatisfaction begins to register. Self-awareness grows. Authority persists, but attention shifts inward. The medieval world does not resolve desire, nor eliminate regulation. It balances them. Survival and stability dominate. Pleasure exists within limits. Guilt is present but manageable. Risk is acknowledged and measured. Intimacy persists, quietly, within these boundaries. Generations inherit rhythms. Desire, regulation, endurance, and tenderness coexist, shaping social norms, identity, and emotional life. Stability outweighs indulgence. Continuity outweighs novelty. Life moves forward in repetition, in rhythm, in habit. The medieval world endures quietly, persistently, without fanfare, without resolution. People do not expect clarity or liberation. They expect survival, continuity, and the small comforts of everyday life. Even the most intimate acts, sex, tenderness, companionship, are threaded into endurance. They are not central, but they are vital. They remind that humanity persists within constraint, that pleasure and survival coexist, and that continuity is its own quiet reward. Desire, regulation, endurance, and tenderness blend into the texture of daily existence. The medieval world is neither exotic nor strange. It is patient. It is enduring. It is human. As the hours stretch further, the medieval world settles into a rhythm almost imperceptible yet unbroken. Life is measured not in dramatic events but in cycles: dawn, labor, meal, rest, night. Desire, including sexual desire, moves quietly alongside these cycles, present but patient, integrated into survival rather than defining it. The body wakes early, stiff from sleep, shaped by the previous day's work and the labor yet to come. Hunger presses immediately. Pleasure, when it arrives, is brief, incidental, almost accidental. Desire bends to circumstance, never urgent, never absent. Life itself dictates rhythm more than impulse. Proximity is constant. Crowded homes, workshops, and fields keep bodies near. Hands brush. Shoulders press. Children crawl and play underfoot. Touch is ordinary, practical, and often unnoticed. Intimacy arises subtly, rarely declared, shaped by what survival allows. Evening offers a pause from labor, not necessarily from activity. Darkness falls early. Fires are lit, providing warmth and light. Rooms are small. Heat is shared, pressing bodies together for warmth, comfort, or companionship. Privacy is limited. Desire, when expressed, is quiet, mediated by practicality rather than passion. Intimacy is slow, deliberate, discreet. Marriage structures sexual activity predictably. Husbands expect access, wives negotiate endurance. Children arrive as blessings, obligations, markers of continuity. Pleasure exists but is subordinate. Intimacy is measured, habitual, sometimes tender in fleeting gestures, a lingering hand, a glance, a laugh. Outside marriage, risk increases sharply, illegitimate children carry social consequences. Women bear the weight most heavily, men evade scrutiny with greater ease. Desire persists quietly in barns, shadowed corners, or secluded rooms. Timing and opportunity matter more than intensity. Secrecy becomes essential. Discretion is survival. Religion frames moral understanding. Confession allows acknowledgement of desire, translating private impulses into moral language. Sin is cyclical: act, confess, absolve, continue. Guilt exists but is contained. Pleasure itself is rarely condemned, the threat lies in disorder, in loss of control, in deviation from social expectation. Medical knowledge overlays social and religious frameworks. Men and women are understood through humors: hot, cold, wet, dry. Sexual activity is sometimes recommended, sometimes discouraged, depending on perceived balance. Advice is fragmented, transmitted through mothers, midwives, observation, and rumor. Mistakes are expected, discomfort is normalized. Despite rules, repetition dominates life more than doctrine. Habits harden. Generations inherit norms quietly, without question. Sexuality becomes tradition as much as instinct, integrated into daily life, not defining identity. It exists as endurance, embedded in continuity. Tenderness emerges quietly. A lingering hand, a glance, laughter at a shared moment. Rarely recorded, seldom moralized, yet vital. Intimacy thrives in these unremarked spaces, negotiating the balance between desire and duty, pleasure and survival. Privacy grows slowly. Architecture evolves. Fewer people share rooms. Curtains and doors allow separation. Reflection grows. Desire internalizes, becoming personal, less dictated by observation or communal norms. Dissatisfaction begins to register. Self-awareness develops. Authority persists, but attention turns inward. The medieval world does not resolve desire nor eliminate regulation. It balances them. Survival and stability dominate. Pleasure exists within limits. Guilt is present but manageable. Risk is acknowledged and measured. Intimacy continues quietly within these boundaries. Generations inherit rhythm.